Hello, everyone, and welcome once again to another episode of Strategies for Living with author and international speaker Doug Sparks. Today, Doug will be talking about those who are responsible for leading the postmodern agenda. And now, here's Doug.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back as we continue our discussion on the postmodern era, postmodernity, and taking a look at kind of the end game, as it were, of where's this pony taking us, and do we want to ride this pony clear to the end, or want to jump off somewhere? But yeah, just to set the record straight, I think that one is not out to demonize all of postmodernity. Obviously, the pure capitalistic structure is flawed. There's no question about that. I think the question is, how does one responsibly try to work and engage in such a way that the obvious issues that need to be addressed can be addressed, and at the same time not become too destructive for no reason. In other words, you know, if you've got a computer that's a pretty complicated machine, and you got bits of it that either you don't like or aren't working well, I would suggest that where you can, you go in and fix it, as opposed to taking a sledgehammer and smashing it to smithereens and hoping that somehow things are going to get better. So it's a fine line here, and I know one could easily be categorized, he's a capitalist, or he's a postmodern in terms of purely pejorative terms where it's mutually exclusive. And my persuasion on this is, in order for it to be beneficial, that we absolutely must continue a conversation. And hopefully down the road, as we get in a little further down, we're going to have other participants, people sitting in, where we can continue the conversation and maybe unpack some of these things in such a way that it might be a bit more applicable and understandable. But as I understand it now, and again, that's a big qualification, but I'm trying to figure out, okay, where is postmodernity going? What's the end game? And at least with Marx, you have to give him credit. He stuck on the end, after all the revolution and everything going through, he stuck on the end, the carrot of a utopian society, of a society that would be just and honest and fair and equitable and all these things that we want to see happen. However, none of those came about. I think with postmodernity, they didn't even try. They didn't want to stick a carrot on the end, because I think in their own mind, we're going off the cliff, so let's go off the cliff and see what happens. And you can do that, but the chances of it turning out well, in my opinion, are pretty slim. So I think what we have to do is figure out a way, some wiggle room here, that we can advance our propositions and advance our understanding of postmodernity and modernity and what they were fighting against, and still the old capitalistic issue of the haves and the have-nots, which apparently, even though in our particular situation, the haves have quite a bit. I mean, if you make $32,000 a year, you are in the 1% of global people in terms of wealth. Even though in the West, the have and the have-nots are still vastly different, vastly separated, still, the have-nots in the West, if you make $32,000 a year, you are in the 1% of the wealthiest people on the face of the earth. And so, okay, you're in the upper 1%. You want to get it in the upper 0.1%. But the idea is, okay, this is working reasonably well. I'm reminded of the quip by Winston Churchill. And by the way, if you want to improve your vocabulary, read Winston Churchill. He has to have one of the greatest vocabularies of anybody. But all that to say that he was very good with his quips. And he said something to the effect that capitalism is criticized for its unequal distribution of its blessings, whereas communism is glorified for its equal distribution of its miseries. And so you've got to take it that, okay, we're in a capitalistic system, it's not perfect, but still, there is upward mobility, there's still, even though we're in the have-nots, we're still pretty good, pretty well off. Now, do we want to take the sledgehammer and smash it all down? Or is there a possibility of taking the system and reforming it? Now, I understand that for most people, they say the hierarchies, the systems are corrupt, and they are. But if they're usually corrupted at the top, disenfranchised at the bottom. It happens to every hierarchy. The question is, can we tweak it without destroying it? Because if you end up following the postmoderns' proclamations and where they would like to take this, you end up in total anarchy. And there's no good recourse when I've lived in anarchy in Lebanon during the Civil War. No law and order, no, obviously, police, no restrictions. There were about 12 armed militias, all fighting each other at given different militias fighting each other at different times. You actually had to listen to BBC in the morning to find out which militias were fighting who during the day, so you know which parts of the city were safe to go into and which weren't. So I've seen anarchy up close, and it doesn't work. It would be one thing if human nature was ultimately virtuous, let's put it that way, that all of humans only wanted the best for everybody. So anarchy only works if every human being was totally virtuous. Not sure about that. Maybe look at your own heart. I know, look at mine. I wish I could say I was totally virtuous, but not so much. And maybe you're similar to that. So that's probably not a good strategy. But yet, if you take, again, let's just take this to its logical conclusion. For example, if you want to do away with all sexism, then you have to destroy one part of that, male or female. You have to blend it and say there's no such thing as that. If you want to fix the racism problem, then you have to say, well, there's no such thing as race. It's a social construct. We can tear that away, and we've solved racism. And you can go through all of the problems. If human beings are really a threat to destroy the world, the best thing you can do is get rid of human beings. And you might say, oh, that's preposterous. Nobody would ever consider that. Well, when you think about it, if you look at it if there's no morality, there's no truth, there's no meaning, there's no value system, and human beings are simply a species, like any other species of the thousands and maybe millions of species in the world, a lot of species have gone extinct, and hasn't seemed to bother the history of the world very much. What would happen if humans went extinct? What if we had a voluntary human extinction movement? Now, you say, actually it exists. There's a group out there called the Voluntary Human Extinction Movement, led by a guy named Les Knight. So, I've got a great solution for the climate change issue. Let's make all humans extinct. And then the world will go on unabated and probably, not have too many problems. Probably do a lot better without us. That's an option, I suppose. And you say, oh, you could never do that. Well, I'm not so sure. China, remember, they required you only have one kid. What if the global community got together and say, okay, nobody's going to have kids. Children, any child born will be killed immediately. And so don't even bother. And so in about, I don't know how many, I haven't done the math, but in how many decades or generations, the humans would go extinct. And if the premise is true that we are the greatest threat to the global existence, maybe that's a good idea. I mean, I don't buy into it, but there could be some people I'll tell you what happens if we live and reduce ourselves to anarchy. It will never stay in anarchy for very long, because that vacuum will be filled by somebody or something. And you can only keep your fingers crossed and hope. I hope it's better. Looking at history, the probability of it being better, almost zero, in my opinion. I'm sure the serfs sitting in Russia under the Tsar thought, what could be any worse than this? How about Stalin? Or the people in China, what could be worse than this? How about Mao? It can be a lot worse. And I think, one of the themes is, hey, life is tough, don't make it worse. That's a pretty good theme. Hey, things aren't very, they're not exactly just and equitable and on and on. Okay, but let's not make it worse. Let's work and try to make it better. So the postmodern condition is one that is just coming. It hasn't fully expressed itself yet. I would say we're seeing now maybe the 5%. And normally a new philosophy takes about 60 years to work its way into the culture. And it usually comes in through other philosophers and academics. And oh, by the way, each one of these postmodern philosophers spent a good bit of time in the United States in some of our most prestigious universities. And so, we've had this in the system for a long time, probably for almost 40 years. And so this is, if you're in the academic world and the philosophy, you've known about this for a very long time. What it does, though, is it usually then moves from the academia, or moves from the intellectual and the philosophical into the academic world, and then is introduced into our universities. And there, with the professors and others who are teaching, the people who come out of the universities then bring it into our educational system. And then from the educational system, it actually comes back out into our families and our societies and our neighborhoods and our culture, and then is begin to be expressed in a much broader way. So this movement of the postmodern philosophy is just starting now. And we really need to sit down and have some very serious discussions. Let's take the good, if there's things we need to learn from postmodernism, and I'm convinced there are some things that we can take and make applicable and work it into the system. Totally destroying the entire system, I think, is probably not a good idea. So I'll leave it at that. Now, the question we want to look at and take a few minutes here to evaluate is, how is this agenda being driven? What is the power behind it? Now, I have to admit, I stumbled on this by accident, and I could be wrong on this. I'm not gonna, I will not die at the stake defending this, but I think it has some probability of being mostly true, mostly accurate. So let me tell you the story. I don't remember, it was probably 5 or 6 or 7 years ago. It could have been during Trump's administration. I don't know, to be honest. But I noticed in the news media that oftentimes they were using a fact checker. You know, somebody would say something and they would say, well, we sent it to the fact checkers, and the fact checkers say, no, that's not true. Or the fact checkers say, yes, indeed, that is true. So I'm sitting there one day thinking, who are the fact checkers? When they say we're checking with who are these guys? And so, again, I started rummaging around on the internet and found out that, of all places, there's the University of Southern Florida has a campus in northern Florida, in Jacksonville. So you would think you'd keep it in the south, but just to be confusing. So University of Southern Florida has a campus in northern Florida in Jacksonville. Now, Jacksonville has a journalism department, and that journalism department morphed into what was called the Poynter Institute. Now, they have what's called PolitiFact, and it is one with Snoops, and there's a number of others that are fact checkers. But back in the day, this was 5, 6, 7 years ago, PolitiFact was the one that most media outlets checked with to find out if the facts were indeed true. So then I said, well, who supports the fact checkers? You know, who supports this PolitiFact group? Now, 7 years ago, it was the easiest thing in the world to find because it was all over. I didn't even have to look. Actually, a week or so ago, I wanted to double check and I couldn't find it anywhere. It had been completely cleansed, shall we say. But 7 years ago, it was the easiest thing to find that one of the major contributors and funders of the PolitiFact fact-checking was a guy named George Soros. And I had no idea who George Soros was at the time. I should have probably, now that I know who he is. But at the time, I didn't. I think he may have owned the San Diego Padres. I think he owned a sports team at one point, and because they were in the league with the Rockies, maybe that. But other than that, I knew nothing about the guy. Come to find out, he's a really, really interesting character. He was born in Hungary to a Jewish family, and unfortunately, it was right during the time when the Nazis invaded. So, as we all know, being in a Jewish family when the Nazis are around is not a good thing. And so his father had set up a kind of a plan, and they were not able to leave, so they changed their identity to be Christians, to be a Christian family. And lo and behold, thank God, it worked. And they were never discovered, which was a miracle in itself. And then when he was old enough, I think about 17 or 18, he left for England, and extremely brilliant, really bright guy, and he always wanted to be a philosopher. That was what his goal was. He loved philosophy, he was good at it. And so he went to London and attended the London School of Economics. And while he was there, he had a year where not exactly a gap year, I don't know the British system all that well, but there was a year where he had to kind of take off in order for him to finally graduate at some level. And during that period of time, he was interested in philosophy. So he took as his tutor a guy named Karl Popper. And Popper was a teacher of philosophy at the university, and he tutored Soros for several years, and they became really good friends. Popper was Austrian, and so they spoke German, and I'm sure they were able to communicate well and became really good friends. Soros then came to the United States, got involved in Wall Street, created one of the early hedge funds, and made a tremendous amount of money. He has been extremely successful and that was probably in the 70s or so. So it's been 50 some years that he has been using his wealth to support causes that he thinks are worthy. Now, he is just one of a group of what I've termed it. I'm not sure what it's exactly called, but I think it's called the neo-progressives. So we knew 120 years ago or so, when, remember, at the end of the 19th century or the 20th century, there was this tremendous excitement that man starting with man, we were going to create the perfect world. Well, those were the progressives. Those were the days that we're going to make a world that's got, justice and freedom and equality and parity and on and on and on. That didn't work out so well. But now here we are in the year 2000, from the 1980s and 90s. We've got a new group of progressives that say, if you read them, guess what they're saying? Hey, guess what? Man starting with man, we can create a better world. It's going to be, and and even the postmodern philosophers, one of their key words was freedom. Freedom was it. Now in the neo progressives, that's the same word. You get inequity, freedom, equality, on and on and on. We are going to create a much better world, and we are going to do it by financing groups and movements and people that we think are going to bring forth this agenda in the most positive manner. And so as I started looking around, I've just found that here's just some of George Soros started giving in a big way in about 1979. Now, it's hard for somebody like me, and if you're just a normal person, to figure out where all Soros's money is coming from, because he has a multitude of different foundations. And so it's hard to figure it out. The best I've been able to find in terms of other people who've done the research is that since 1979, George Soros has given roughly $32 billion to various causes, to literally hundreds of causes in more than 100 nations. Now, Soros, I think, from what I've read and people have described him, he's a globalist. And so his idea is that he wants to make this not just for the West. He wants to take this agenda and impose it, encourage it throughout the world, which of course, if it is going to make the world a better place, who wouldn't want to do that, all right? You'd want to put your money in places that you think are going to give you the best chance. Now, so far, the progressives, and he in particular, is given $140 million to people, to different PACs, and he's given a couple $100 million to get progressive judges and district attorneys to be elected. His Open Society Foundation, which is the one that's the best well known, has been giving millions of dollars to defund the police, to abolition of bail, and that comes through the DAs, to the fact checkers. Now, right now there's this data might be a little bit out of date, but at the time there were 11 organizations that were part of the International Fact-Checking Network, and of those 11 organizations, 8 of them were funded by these folks. And this will tell you kind of who the progressives are. So it was Bill and Melinda Gates and the Gates Foundation, Google, Facebook, Washington Post, Open Society Foundation, and others that are supporting the progressive funding. So, for example, Rick Whelan, he's worth approximately, George Soros right now is worth about $6 billion. Rick Whelan, who was the number 2 employee of Microsoft, he's worth about $175 million. He's dead, he died, but he gave over $200 million to 60 organizations to promote gay rights starting in the 1980s. Rick Hoffman, who founded LinkedIn, is worth $2 billion. He's financially backed most movements that label any discourse that goes against the postmodern narrative as being disinformation. Bill Gates and Paul Allen, who were the 2 founders of Microsoft, are worth $100 billion. Mark Zuckerberg, Facebook, Instagram is worth $61 billion. Google, YouTube, Larry Page and Sergey Brin worth $170 billion. If you add all these up, just between this handful, and this is probably maybe a tenth of the people that are involved in the progressive movement, you've got almost $500 billion that's available to push forward their agenda. Now, all I'm saying is it could be purely coincidental. It could be, just the greatest of accidents that all of these guys, their names keep showing up on these progressive organizations that want to usher in postmodern philosophy and ideals. And so when you've got that much money that is being put into political, you can buy a lot, let's be honest, you can buy a lot of politicians for $500 billion. You can buy a lot of judges and DAs and media coverage and on and on and on. Now, I would say this, I am not, and I want to make it clear, I am not a conspiratorialist. I don't believe in conspiracies. You've got to be too smart to do that. I don't think anybody's smart enough to carry this off. So I don't believe in that at all. However, I am a believer in collaborative cooperation. I think, and it makes sense, if you have common worldview and you have common ideals and you want to push a common agenda, you're going to act probably in concert with others who have the similar ideas and values and to push the agenda forward. And so all I'm saying is, don't trust me, okay? Don't trust me. Check it out for yourself. And I would say the best thing you can do is be a skeptic. Never take anything at face value. Always question, always ask, where did this come from? Who's pushing the agenda? What's the final outcome? And oh, by the way, is it something that I think is going to be good for me and for the world? Or is it something that needs to be questioned and maybe opposed in some ways so that we can get to a place where all of us can be helped and live in a better place? Hope you join us again next time. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for listening. Join us next time on Strategies for Living with Doug Sparks.